Two men looked out their prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. Two men looked in a valley one day. One saw a giant, the other saw his prey. It's about perspective. Perspective is how we view our lives, and perspective is how we live our lives. So the question is, do we have a worldly perspective, or do we have a God can do anything perspective? That's the question we have to ask. How do we live our lives? Is it the worldly way, or is God can do anything he wants in our lives? I like Numbers 13, the story. We all know it. It's Israel's been roaming around the desert for almost 40 years. The place they had to go where God promised them was really an 11-day journey. But because they weren't learning their lessons, and because they weren't trusting God, God kept them there for almost 40 years. And they're at the end of the road, and now they're close to Canaan, or the land that God said, hey, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And so Moses gathers 12 guys and says, I want you to go over the Jordan. I want you to go look at that land and see what's out there. And so 12 guys go. They spy out the land. They look at everything. They're amazed. It is what God said. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. The food was abundant. There was houses they didn't build, and wells they didn't dig, and vineyards they didn't plant. And man, when they got a cluster of grapes, it was so big they had to put it on a pole, and two guys had to carry it. And that's what they brought back to Moses. But there was a caveat, right? They came back and Moses said, what's going on? And they said, hey, look at the grapes in this land. And it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land, and there's no way we can go in there. They make us look like we're grasshoppers in their sight, and they would destroy us. And out of the 12, only two, Caleb and Joshua, said, no way, let's go take it. God promised us the land. So if he promised us the land, he's going to give, no matter if the giants were 100 feet tall, we're going to take it. And the 10 said no, and the 2 said yes, and they had two different perspectives. One had worldly perspectives, or 10 had worldly perspectives. We can't do it. They're bigger than us. And 2 had God can do anything perspective. That was the difference between Saul and David. Saul looked at the giant and said, he was afraid, and it said that he was dismayed. And David looked at the giant and said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? It was almost as David already saw Goliath dead. It was like there was no question in his mind. There was no doubt. There was nothing that would even hinder him from saying, what are you guys afraid of? This guy's dead. This guy's a dog. This guy's done. And that was the difference. Saul had a worldly perspective. And David said, God can do anything, and he can. God can do anything he wants. I want to tell a story that I think only a couple of people in my life know. And I don't share this story because they don't believe. Nobody will believe this story. But anyways, I'm going to share it because God can do anything. And one day it was in 2002. I was driving home in Oregon. I was going down South Cow Creek Road, and there was a car in front of me, and I was going to turn left into my driveway and go home. And there was a car in front of me, and a squirrel ran in front of that car, and that car smashed that squirrel. But it caught the squirrel halfway in the back. So the squirrel was smashed to the ground halfway. And he had his arms like this, but he couldn't go because his whole back part was smashed to the ground. So he was like that, and he was stuck. And then when the car left, I kind of drove and looked out my window, and I could see him, the squirrel, doing this, but he was done. His back was smashed. And I drove in the driveway, and I'm like, oh, he's still alive. I got to go put it out of him. It's misery. And so I go in the garage, I took out a shovel. And I'm walking, that's when I was walking up the driveway and I'm going, Lord, I don't want to do this. Lord, I don't want to do this. And I go up to the thing and the squirrel, he's doing this. I said, Lord, I don't want to hit it. And then all of a sudden, the squirrel starts shaking and then popped up and ran into the woods. And I looked up and I said, thank you, Lord. And I walked back and put my shovel back. And I don't tell hardly anybody that story, but God showed me in 2002, I can do anything. There's nothing I can't do. And David knew that. And he said, who is this Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? And then somebody told Saul what David was saying. And that's where we pick it up in verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're just a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I can't walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David just took them off. I love that story. It's pretty cool. This is a stark contrast between two men who say they both believe in God. They both say they believe in God. David says, I can do anything with the Lord. This is nothing. And Saul says, you can't. Look at that giant. Look at your circumstances. And David's saying, no, I don't want to look at my circumstances. I want to look at the Lord. And that is the difference. So there's a few questions I want to ask. What did David say? Why was it such a big deal that he said those things? And why could he say those things? So what did David say? He said a few things. He said when he heard Goliath come down and start making fun of Israel's army, he said, who is this guy? He's nothing. Who does he think he is? And the second thing he says, let not anybody's heart be troubled. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to fight against this Philistine. Now, keep in mind, he's 14 or 15 years old. That is amazing. And there's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 soldiers of Israel lined up, and this 14-year-old guy says, what are you guys afraid of? I'll go out and fight with this guy. And why was that such a big deal? Because it was a stark contrast against everybody else. David stood out. He stood out. He wasn't talking like everybody else talked. He wasn't acting like everybody else acted. He acted totally different, and because of that, he stood out, and people are saying, okay, why can you say these things? That's how we are to live our lives. We're supposed to stand out. We're supposed to talk not like the world talks. We're supposed to talk differently than anybody else talk. When people are saying, this is crazy, we say, this is no big deal. I can walk through this fire. I can walk through this flood. I can walk through this turbulence. I can walk through this trial because I have a God that has always taken care of me. He's always protected me. He's always provided for me. Yes, it's difficult, and yes, it's tough, but God is bigger. And we are to act differently than anybody else. All of the army of Israel was talking, but David was talking differently. And because of that, it reached the ears of the king. And they said, there's a kid out here that's saying some crazy things. And Saul said, well, then bring him here. And he did. The interesting thing is, why could David say these things? First thing is, 1 Samuel 13, God said, because he's a man after my own heart. And he was just a kid. And you think about that. You think of, we're going to look at David's life periodically through as we study 1 Corinthians. And you look at David's life and you go, wow, how can God really say that? Yes, he was the psalmist, and yes, he worshiped the Lord, but he was an adulterer. He was a murderer. He was a liar. He took chances. They weren't smart chances. And God said, he's a man after my own heart. And the reason is David sought after a relationship with God. Not just believe in God, not just follow the commandments of God. He chased after. He's a man after my own heart. He chased after God to know God. And when he sinned, he kept the leash short. You know, and the big sin, when Nathan came to him and rebuked him over the adultery, it was a year. David kept that in for a year without repenting. And finally, God loved him so much that he sent him Nathan. But David could say that because he had a relationship with God. And because he had a relationship with God, he knew God, and he knew how much God loved him. Not only that, he knew what God told Abraham in Genesis, where he says, I'll bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. David knew that. David knew that was God's promise, that I will bless anybody that blesses my people, and I will curse anybody that curses my people. And Goliath has been cursing Israel for 40 days. And David knew that. And so he said, I'm going to take this guy out. Secondly, David had a testimony. He had a testimony. Hey, I was taking care of my father's sheep, and a lion came in, and I took that lion out. All I had was a staff and a sling and maybe a knife, and that lion came. I didn't run away. God appointed me to take care of my father's sheep, and that lion is not going to hinder that. And he went out. He chased after the lion and took care of it. A bear came and tried to take a sheep. David said, I caught it by the beard, and I killed it. And he had a testimony of what God had done for him. And I was thinking about this late last night. I was thinking, do we have a testimony? Do we have a testimony like the blind man? Remember the blind man that Jesus healed? And the apostles come up to Jesus and say, who sinned, is him or his mother, that he was born blind? And Jesus said something amazing. Neither him or his parents sinned that he was born blind, but he was born blind so that God would get the glory, that God's glory would be revealed. Think about that. This guy lived 38 years with a blindness, with a trial, tribulation, with an infirmity, so that God would be glorified. Some would think that's horrible. Some would think I can't believe you have to go through that. And God said, no, I did that so that I would be glorified. I did that. So this guy can have a testimony. And we don't look at things from a godly perspective. We always look at things from a horizontal perspective rather than a vertical perspective, because everybody on the planet would think this is a bummer, and God said this is a blessing. And then when they asked the guy, who do you think Jesus is? He said, I don't know, but all I know is this: I was blind and now I see. I have a testimony. And David had a testimony. Pretty crazy. I think about John chapter 4, the woman at the well. She's going to the well at noon, it says, hot, 110 degrees, 120 degrees. And the young ladies would all come early in the morning before it got hot. And so you think, why is this gal coming to get water at noon? It's because she was an outcast and they wouldn't let her. She couldn't hang with the other girls because she's had 5 husbands. And the one she's living with isn't her husband. And it says early in that chapter that Jesus told his apostles, I gotta go to Samaria. And they're like, Samaria? Nobody goes, Jews don't go to Samaria. They cross the Jordan, they pass Samaria, they cross the Jordan again just to go to Judea. And nobody goes to Samaria. Jesus says, I gotta go. I got an appointment there. And Jesus is sitting at this well, and then from a distance he sees a silhouette coming, and it's a gal, and she has this water pot, and it's hot, and she comes to the well, and Jesus says, can you give me some water? And she says, how is it you, being a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for some water? And he says, oh, if you would have known, if you know who it is that asked you for water, you would ask me for water, and I'd give you living water. And once you get this living water, you'll never thirst again. She said, I want that water. Jesus said, okay, go get your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus said, oh, good. I'm glad you told me the truth. And Jesus was affirming her. I'm glad you told me the truth because you've had 5 husbands. And the one you're living with isn't your husband. In that you spoke truthfully. She's like, busted. Are you a prophet? And after she was done with Jesus, she couldn't believe that he would speak to her. No one else would speak with her. No one else had wanted anything to do with her. No one else wanted to hang out with her. And Jesus said, I have an appointment with her. And she left him and went out to Samaria and said, I have met the Messiah. And Jesus went in there, and then a lot of people followed. Jesus used this gal, and now she has a testimony. David had a testimony. I killed a lion and I killed a bear, and this guy is going down just like them. David knew that God honored faith. Hebrews, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so we need to, everything we do is out of faith. And we, I think, need to step out in faith more. And share our testimony, because testimony brings hope. Testimony always brings hope. Because David said, there was a lion, I killed it. There was a bear, I killed it. And this Philistine, I'm going to kill him too. And then what did Saul do? All right, go and God be with you. There was a little bit of hope now. They were dismayed. They were fearful. We're going to be their slaves. And now David said, don't worry about it. I killed a bear, I killed a lion. This guy's no different. And then there's a little bit of hope welling up in Saul and said, go, God bless you. The Lord be with you. That's why I think we always need to share our testimonies, because it brings about hope. This is what God did for me. And he'll do the same for you. Saul, on the other hand, 3 things about Saul. Saul had a horizontal perspective. He really did. He had a horizontal perspective. He looked at the giant and he said, we're done. He never thought about God. Never. Not one thought about God can deliver us. Not one thought about bringing in the prophets and let's sacrifice and let's see if the Lord, not one thought about that. Saul had a horizontal perspective rather than a vertical perspective. Saul did not have a testimony because he never trusted the Lord and he never had a relationship with the Lord. He didn't have a testimony to say, God had delivered me this way and he'll deliver us now. So don't worry, everybody. He's the king. He needs to comfort his troops, and he couldn't do it. Instead, a 14-year-old kid had to comfort the army of Israel when the king should have. And now David's going to be king. And then thirdly, Saul always relied on worldly means. So David said, go and the Lord be with you. But before you go, here's this helmet, mine. Now, he has a bronze helmet, you get a bronze helmet. He has a coat of mail, you get a coat of mail. He has a sword, you get a sword. And then David starts walking and it's like, he can't walk, and David's like, I don't need this stuff. But Saul said, the world does this, so we need to do this. And he looked at the things of what the world does, and he starts copying the world, and that's where, unfortunately, the church is today. The church looks like the world. It looks like a concert at the world. You can't tell that this is what the world does, so let's do this. This is how the world dresses, so let's dress this. This is what the world does, so let's mimic the world. And God says, no, we got to be totally different. We got to talk different. We got to act different. We have to be different so people can see the light and see that we're different and want to be with us. Saul always used worldly, he used carnal man. And so what happens next? Look at verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, David did, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine, and so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. And the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth. He was ruddy and he was good looking. And so the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with stakes? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Wow. I love that. There's Goliath. There's Goliath, 9'9", and here's this 14-year-old. Ruddy means he was redheaded, and good looking, and the contrast. David probably wasn't even taller than the Goliath's armor bearer that was holding the shield. The shield was probably bigger than David. It was pretty amazing. All that David had was a sling, and he reached into the brook, and he got 5 smooth stones. How come? Because he was a bad shot. Not really. Goliath had 4 brothers, and David knew that. And Goliath had 4 brothers. With Goliath is 5. And David said, I have a stone, 1 for each of you. Pretty amazing. 2 Samuel, if you want to look it up, 2 Samuel chapter 21, 1 Chronicles chapter 20 gives us the names of Goliath's brothers. One was Sippai, which means terminate. He was a terminator. He was really big. And the other guy was Lahami, which means food for the beast. He left his enemies as food for the beast of the field. The other one was Ishba-Anab. And the fourth guy, his name was Saph, which says that he had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and each foot. And those were Goliath's brothers. And David knew that. And there was 5 kids, and David, and the father was named Raph. Anyways, David took 5 stones and said, 1 for each of you. That is how David thought. That is how David's mindset. He had a God can do anything mindset. And so who killed these guys? Well, if you look, later on, we'll look at them. It was David's mighty men that killed Goliath's brothers. And we'll look at that story. Pretty amazing. David's mighty men, yeah. 1 Samuel, I want to tell you who their mighty men was. 1 Samuel 22:2. Listen. David's hiding in the caves from Saul. Saul wants to kill him. And people are hearing that David is hiding in the caves. And some went out to meet him. And he says, the ones that came out, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented, gathered to David, so he became the captain over them. That was David's mighty men. Those that were distressed, they were in debt, they were discontented, society didn't want anything to do with them. They were on the outs with everybody, with all their friends, their family, their towns, and David's hiding, and they go, we might as well go with David. And so they go with David, and David became the captain over them. And they are the ones that killed the giants. That's a picture of David, as David's a picture of Jesus. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And all of us who have been discontented, distressed, in debt, go to the greater than David. And they saw David do the things that David did. And they heard the things that David had done. And they said, well, if David can do it, we can do it. That's hope. That's a testimony. And they are the ones. If David can do it, 2 Samuel chapter 23, we'll look at it in about 2 months. We'll look at David's mighty men. Pretty crazy. The things they accomplished. So the question is, what was David's motive? What was David's motive? Look at the last part of verse 46. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, then all the assembly shall know that there is a Lord, that the Lord doesn't save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. That was David's motive. It wasn't so that everybody would think how awesome I am. It wasn't so everybody think what great warrior I am at 15 years old or whatever. It was so that everybody would know that there was a God in Israel. And that Israel themselves know that God delivers not with sword or spear, but he delivers without anything like that. He can deliver with us just standing here. Listen, it's all about motive. It's all about why do we do what we do? It's all about motive. Listen, this is really important. It's possible to do the right thing with the wrong motive. And it's possible to do the wrong thing with the right motive. And which one do you think God will honor? It's all about motive. Here's why. You're doing the wrong thing with the right motive, and it just takes a little bit for God to change your direction. And now you're humming along. But if you're doing the right thing with the wrong motive, that's a heart issue. And that can take a lifetime to straighten out. And David was all about the Lord. I'm going to show everybody. His motive is right. And that's why Paul says, whatever you do in work or deed, do all for the glory of God. Whatever you do for work or deed. And so what happens next? Look at verse 48. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David, here's an amazing thing, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out his stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it and out of the sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah rose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley of the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistine fell along the road of Sha'raim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistine, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I don't know. And so the king said, inquire whose son this young man is. Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand, and said to him, whose son are you, young man? And so David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Well, that's amazing. I could just picture David just running around with Goliath. And that head must have been that big, and he had him by the hair. Because it said that he took it to Jerusalem, right? He took the head to Jerusalem, and then Saul told Abner, come and bring him here. And he went to Jerusalem, bring him. David still had his head. He's like, everywhere he went, he probably had it hanging off his horse. He probably went into town, the grocery store, showing everybody. Pretty amazing what David did. But what struck me is that David, when Goliath finally went to battle for him, David just took a beeline towards him. You see in the movies, David's like, going backwards. That's not what David just took off running towards him. It's pretty amazing. David was on the offensive. He wasn't on the defense. He was on the offense. I wish, one of the guys I want to see, besides everybody, Jesus, you want to see Jesus when you get to heaven. But one of the guys is David, just to sit there and just hang out with him. Pretty amazing. He just ran. Can you imagine running towards a 9'9" warrior when you have a sling and rocks? Their rocks are banging against each other, and he's running, and no fear. Had no doubt that Goliath was done, and no doubt. In Matthew 16, Jesus was talking to Peter and the boys, and he said to Peter, "You are Petra. On this Petros, I will build my church." He said, "You're a little stone, but on this big stone, me, I'll build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Gates are a defensive tool, right? So the gates of hell won't prevail. That means that Jesus pictures the church on the offensive. The gates of hell will not prevail. That means the church is banging on the gates of hell. It's cutting it down, shutting it down, breaking it apart. The church is on the offense. Right now, the church isn't on the offense. We're stable. We're on the growth plan, right? But we need to be on the offense against the gates of hell, and sharing the gospel and people getting saved, and not just building our ministry empires. It's a totally different motive. And David made sure that Goliath wasn't going to get up. He cut off his head. And that's a guarantee. He didn't get up. I tried to picture what it looked like with David hanging on to Goliath's head wherever he went. He put his armor in his tent, but he held on. He's like, look at what the Lord did. Look at what the Lord did. Look at what the Lord did. I think we need to do more of that. He liked to show off what God had done. And what struck me was 1 Corinthians 1, that God uses the weak, the base, the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. Everybody was confounded when David ran towards Goliath. Everybody was like, what is going on here? And Paul goes on to say that no flesh would glory in his presence. Now, that's why I think Samson looked like Barney Fife. There's no way, we see Sam, he's just on TV, he's this giant guy that's like Goliath, and No, I think he looked like Gilligan or Barney Fife, because they were saying, what is the secret of your strength? And if he was a giant guy with giant muscles, they'd go, but they couldn't figure it out. That's how God works. He doesn't work like we think he works. So Samson wasn't this giant of a guy. He was a Barney Fife of a guy with long straggly hair, and he did some amazing things, and no one can figure it out until Delilah. And Delilah figured it out. But that's how God works. He uses the weak things, the base things, the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. That day, the truth came out. That Goliath was a child and David was the giant. And it was because he had a God can do anything mentality. And that's my heart. That's my prayer, that we start living that way. That God can do anything. God can do anything. Even though people are saying, no, look at that. Look at your circumstances. Look at that. There's no way. Well, God can do whatever he wants. He can make a squirrel shake and pop up and run into the woods. He can do anything. Amen? Amen. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for the lessons of the heroes of the faith of old. And I pray, Father, that we can have that kind of faith, to know that you have the best interest in mind for us, and that you can do anything. That's how we want to live. In Jesus' name, amen. 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 That is the story of David and Goliath.